Okay, so as we get started on this last session, I'm going to give you two pieces of encouragement in this late part of the day. Okay, one is that it's a lot later for Anke than it is for us. Okay, and she had an unexplained visa rejection earlier in the week, which prevented her from being with us. So I really am grateful that she was willing to stay up past midnight to join us for this conversation. But the second thing that you should also be encouraged about is I made it possible for the bar to open before the poster session so that immediately after we're done here, you can get a drink. So let's just say there's things that will be there when we're done. Okay? So in this final conversation, this is something that I really was interested in, and also some members of the scientific committee. We had a discussion about sort of including feminist philosophy of science as a sort of theme to talk about during the course of the conference. And I thought that it was especially appropriate given the role that Minnesota had in terms of a number of faculty being here, some of the writing on that topic, and as well, some people who took their PhD here. And so I really wanted to have a conversation about that. So I've got two individuals who are going to share some of their expertise in this area, and then we'll also have some time for questions around that. So I want to just begin, and Anke, I'm going to sort of come to you first, but I want both you and Kristina to start with the following question. What are one or two important things everyone needs to know about the current status of feminist philosophy of science? And those things might be things we're actually not as aware of as we should be, or they might be things that we're aware of and they just need to be reinforced. But what are one or two important things everyone needs to know about the current status of feminist philosophy of science? Anke?
Yeah, so first of all, I wanted to say thank you that I can participate online. I still don't know what happened, why I wasn't allowed to enter the United States. Maybe I've been identified as some sort of subversive feminist element or something. Right. So, but to your question about the current status of feminist philosophy of science. So it's been a field now that has been proliferating for roughly 40 years, starting sort of from critique of androcentrism and sexism in particular scientific disciplines and theories, and moving to a more thorough rethinking of science, objectivity, scientific knowledge, and so on. I think it's a bit difficult to summarize without oversimplifying, but so I think one important strand, or what might unite feminist philosophies of science currently, is an opposition to the atomistic model of knowers that is implicit or explicit in much of earlier or mainstream philosophy of science. So sort of thinking of scientific knowers as individuals that are in principle self-sufficient and interchangeable, versus looking at the social political conditions of knowers, focusing on communities, focusing on the essentially interactive nature of doing science, and considering scientific knowers as knowers that are socially situated and that are differentially socially situated, also with regards to hierarchies of power. Right, and this affects scientific knowledge. It can be an obstacle by creating exclusion, blind spots, bias, or it can be a good thing by sort of helping epistemic diversity. Yeah.
Okay, Kristina.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Luckily, I made it through the immigration, even though I just had some, problems with my voice after crossing the Atlantic. But anyway, I hope my voice is not going to break down. So, about the first question, if I had to give a really general description of feminist philosophy of science, I would say that it's an attempt to rethink the criteria of good science, good scientific practices, so that this goodness has a moral, social dimension in addition to epistemic one. And recognizing also that these two dimensions interact. Okay, so you can't just separate. We have this sort of epistemic study of science, and then sort of ethics of science, and something like political philosophy of science. But it's an attempt to think about these three dimensions and how they interact. I also want to add something related to this historical discussion that we had yesterday. Of course, it goes without saying that feminist philosophy of science owes a lot to the feminist movement, especially in the 1960s, 1970s, and the changing status of women in science. But I think what's really important for philosophy of science, that these developments, they took place around at the same time as the sort of a naturalized approaches to philosophy of science, they gained more momentum. So I think that was really important because sort of that naturalized approaches, they sort of, they gave a justification for this whole project. So, and kind of framework, that sort of enabled, I think, a lot of feminist philosophers to do what they wanted to do. So in philosophy of science, I mean, and otherwise, I think some of those people who just left the field and perhaps do some other, science studies or something else.
So it's not uncommon for there to be sort of myths that grow up around what an area of philosophy is all about. I think that feminist philosophy of science might be something that's particularly susceptible to that. So I'm curious to hear both of you speak to what do you think is a persistent myth that you encounter when you are talking about feminist philosophy of science with others. Maybe that comes from students, maybe that comes from colleagues within or outside the discipline. So, Kristina, do you want to tackle that first?
Okay, well, I think this relates to this values in science discussions. Since feminists were very much at the forefront of criticizing the value-free ideal of science, obviously, and trying to show how, contextual factors, social values can influence science for good and bad. Not just, I think it's important to recognize that not just in the bad ways. So the myth is that if someone is criticizing the value-free ideal of science, they think that, values, non-epistemic values can play just any roles in science, as if, it's okay, whatever, to be engaged in wishful thinking or whatever. I don't know. Perhaps other people who are working on values in science may also, recognize this. Of course, it's a false claim because most scholars who criticize the value-free ideal of science, they often propose some other normative principles to replace the value-free ideal. And, that's an interesting debate about what these principles should be.
Anke?
So I think what Kristina mentioned is a big one, but I think the second big myth I often encounter is the idea that feminist philosophy of science is just for women. So often when I start teaching it, I immediately lose half of the room because they think it's not relevant for them, and then I have to gain them back by making clear that it's not just sort of some niche problem, but it's about general relations between science and politics and values and knowledge. And also that it's not just about women in terms of gender, might also be other genders and also other factors beyond gender that are relevant to political questions and power hierarchies, right? So it might also be about racial bias, for example, and questions of intersectionality. So it's not just for women, it's for everybody, sort of, and about the grand scheme of science. Yeah.
That sounds like a good slogan. It's not just for women. So we are sort of coming to the end of a day of talking about the present in philosophy of science, and people have been commenting a little bit on sort of looking forward. And I think that it's clear that feminist philosophy of science has had an impact on philosophy of science as a field. But I'm curious to hear your perspectives on what do you think is the next best thing? What's coming right around the corner? What holds promise for future scholarship in this area, especially given that in some ways the sort of exciting breakthrough work is arguably been done in certain ways. Does that mean that there are sort of less exciting things ahead, or are there things that are just about to break open that you're thinking about and seeing people work on and are sort of excited to see it emerge, say, in the next 5 to 7 years? Anke, let's go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, so I think this has to do with the function of the value-free ideal. So I think there has been a lot of discussion now of value freedom and critiques of the value-free ideal with in relation to objectivity and truth. So we've had a lot of that, but I think we will see more work in the future about sort of the other functions of the value-free ideal. So these ideas, for example, that we need value-free science to enable democratic decision-making in policy, and also to enable public trust in science and trustworthiness of science. So I think we will have more sort of explicitly also political philosophy of science, feminist political philosophy of science, tackling these questions of the relation between sort of value-laden science and democracy and public trust in science. And I hope we will also see more work in, so I also work in philosophy of psychiatry and medicine, which are rich fields for this kind of scholarships, just because, unfortunately, the history of medicine, for example, has been so thoroughly shot through with sexist and racist assumptions and practices, which still shapes theories and healthcare delivery today. Right? So I would be very interested to see more explicitly feminist work in that area as well. Yeah.
Okay, Kristina?
Yeah, I agree about this. About the list of things that I think are promising that Anke already mentioned. To add something that I might personally find really interesting are debates about diversity in science. So I was hoping to perhaps have more analysis about like how diversity might be beneficial for different areas in academia, and how sort of like social diversity of people, how that might translate into different sort of cognitive diversity, and also what are the obstacles, what kind of policies might work, what may not work. So I think it's a promising area, and it's also promising because I think it's open to very different methodological approaches. So people can do like there's a strong tradition of doing case studies. So that's one way of doing this, but also it's an area that I think is open for those people who want to do modeling, sort of like agent-based modeling. It's also open to just empirical research based on like data. Yeah, for instance, like data on evaluation of grant applications. That we heard about that kind of research earlier today, and many other sort of approaches in philosophy of science.
Okay, let's open things up to our audience for questions. to Anke or Kristina.
Thank you both. So in the past, feminist philosophers of science and also scholars in feminist STS have made great interventions into particular areas of science, such as primatology, immunology, etc. So I was wondering if, I mean, that's a question to both of you, if there is a particular area of present-day science that you would like to see a feminist intervention into, or perhaps there is some recent feminist work on a specific kind of area of scientific research that that you really like.
Okay, well, I guess I'm most familiar with sort of philosophy of social science topics well, I guess also, well, I think there's a space for a lot of interventions in like I think that's one of the benefits of perhaps, you know, doing philosophy of science in this way, that it at least has the potential that one can intervene in various attempts, various kind of studies that in some way or other are biased. Like I recently did or sort of, yeah, I'm actually working myself on a case study which is on the sort of long-term benefits and harms of early childhood education. And I hope to, you know, perhaps to do a bit more research on also in the sort of various approaches and social scientists who study like urban segregation. So these are all sort of, well, I guess they are good topics also because the issues in themselves are sort of already political, and you can clearly see like people, you know, having different approaches, and so that sort of gives material for philosophers of science to more analyze more specifically, like how the values actually intervene, like where are they in the research? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so as I already said, I'm particularly interested in your work in philosophy of psychiatry. So there has been a number of people explicitly applying feminist work here. So, for example, applying Longinus' model of objectivity to psychiatry, or utilizing standpoint theory accounts to think about the sort of the knowledge that psychiatric patients can contribute and how they should be treated, and how this sort of knowledge exchange and the testimonial exchanges between patient and psychiatrists should be happening, how in general, yeah, we should think of participation also in psychiatric science. And I think another field where there is interesting work and that also seems super important to do is AI, machine learning algorithms, and sort of the allure of objectivity and neutrality that can come with that, while going hand in hand with sort of perpetuating racial and gender bias. So I think that's also an important field to work on.
All right, so thanks. So I'm curious, we know that historically feminist philosophy of science, feminist philosophy more generally has been quite marginalized. And I'm curious what your sense is today of where we stand in terms of how, especially colleagues outside of feminist philosophy of science, see feminist work. And if you want to sort of think about that in a more nuanced way, are there particular ways in which you feel like feminist philosophy of science has become more mainstream, particular strands of it that are still marginalized, and what you'd kind of like to see going forward?
Well,
Yep.
Oh, you wanna?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this also in biographical terms. So I think it's gotten much better, at least over, I think, the last 15 years or so I've been doing this. So for example, when I said I want to do my PhD in this field, I was told that this was a stupid idea, that if I want to have a career in philosophy, I absolutely need to demonstrate that I can play with the boys. I don't know if that works. That's a direct translation from German. And I used to sort of not say that I do feminist philosophy of science because I noticed that this is a conversation stopper. So I sometimes like toned it down and said I do social epistemology of science. I think I don't get as negative reactions anymore when I say I do feminist philosophy of science. But that might also be because I'm older. I think there is still sort of some degree of marginalization. And I think also what happens is that many insights and themes from feminist philosophy of science sort of make it to the mainstream, but then the feminist sources are not recognized anymore, right? So then it's just like the science and values debate, or then suddenly everybody is talking about trust in science and that this has already a history in feminist philosophy of science. Sort of, gets out of sight somehow. I don't know. What do you think, Kristina?
Well, I think that it's still marginalized to some degree, it's as you said. I mean, since of course also many people who work in feminist philosophy of science, they also work in other areas, in closely related areas. Like there's a lot of topics in social epistemology that are of interest and have similar concerns. So I've also noticed that sometimes people don't cite the feminist works, but I think also then when it comes to like assessing people in the job market, I still think that there is this structure that people assume that in philosophy of science, like there are certain core areas that are somehow central, and for someone to be a competent practitioner and if you do some feminist work or something else, then that's a bit of it's sort of nice thing, but it doesn't really add to this sort of competence thing. Some things have been changing, of course, during the last like 30 years or so. I mean, like when I was in Minnesota, that's already like 30 years ago, and one thing that I think is positive that when people like organize conferences, there often are papers and sessions. When people edit volumes, they often want to include some of feminist work there, or some at least an entry if it's a handbook or something. So that's a positive development.
And I would like to pick up on your comment, Anke, about important feminist work that shaped the field, but then the feminist reference drops out. It strikes me that one of the things about feminist philosophy of science has been that the conversation there has been much broader, and that a lot of the work in feminist philosophy of science goes beyond philosophy of science. I think of people like Donna Haraway or Karen Barad, who are very prominent figures there and do not really make it over into the conversations about in philosophy of science more narrowly. And I'm wondering if you see a prospect for feminist philosophy not only broadening the debate, let's say, in the way it clearly has around values, but also broadening who counts as doing important philosophy of science.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we see sort of this movement, I think, towards connecting philosophy of science also to other related areas, right, in feminist philosophy. So, for example, we might see this also in the trust discussion, that this relates to feminist ethics, for example. So I do think there is a chance, and obviously so this also branches out into like feminist metaphysics and all sorts of feminist traditions. So yeah, I think there is a potential to like open that up, like it has sort of helped opening up philosophy of science to more sort of political discussions. I think it remains to be seen how that works. I also wanted to add with regard to So Kristina talked about like the importance of diversity and future work on diversity. And when we then think about feminist philosophy of science maybe still being marginalized, and is it a good idea for young people to choose this path if they want to have a tenured position later on? I think we also really need to start thinking about how to actually implement diversity in a way that it doesn't sort of put the people from socially marginalized locations, right, or from positions that are marginalized in the field in like doubly difficult positions, because they are already marginalized, and then they are supposed to do this sort of epistemic diversity work where they open up to other perspectives, or they are being critical of the mainstream, sort of positioning themselves in the margins again. So how can that actually work for people to build a career on that without so I think there are a lot of questions there of how to actually build a research community and develop criteria for assessment of scientific quality that can serve to further that kind of diversity instead of punishing it career-wise.
Yeah, I'm just going to respond to this briefly. Yeah, because I also think that, interestingly, I think some people who were working in this field, they have perhaps themselves sort of like self-selected them somehow outside of philosophy of science, and don't necessarily spend a lot of time and energy in trying to communicate with philosophy of science audiences. But they do have a lot, they have a large audience like outside, in sort of in different sort of social sciences, gender studies. I'm always myself surprised, like, when you want this, like this, academia, edu, and this ResearchGate services send you like reports who's citing you. So like I have a paper on standpoint theory. I don't. Well, you may even remember this because it was part of we were in the same APA session like many years ago, and those papers were published in Hypatia. I didn't really think of it might like in any way big contribution, but anyway, the social scientists, they cite this paper all the time, so so they got something out of it. So that's interesting.
Hi, thank you for being here and sharing your reflections. I guess I'm going to ask for some advice, assuming that I'm not the only person in the room in this situation. So I consider myself to do feminist philosophy of science, but a lot of my work is not about sciences that have to do with people or animals or medicine or anything. So the question is, how do I respond when people say, what's feminist about the philosophy of science you're doing, given that it's not about the things that feminism is normally about?
Can I say? Yeah, because I spent a lot of time, like early in my career thinking about this. And that also has to do because I had some like background I was first a student of physics before I then went over to philosophy of science. I think in many of these like physical sciences where, the subject matter is not like directly related to, cultures, societies, aspects of life where gender, obviously is of interest. I think there's still there's surprisingly a lot of interesting work by science studies scholars in these fields because they focus especially like the sort of scientific culture in those fields and interactions among scientists and all of that. So that I think is so I think social epistemology in general gives you sort of tools to somehow think about how how feminist issues might be relevant even in those areas of science. What do you think, Anke?
Yeah, I agree. It's sort of this curious fact that in the areas where the sort of the contents are not gendered, like I also often get this question, oh, but we don't have this sort of gender bias in theoretical physics, right? But curiously, these are precisely the disciplines often that are worse in terms of gender representation, right? So it must have to do something with the culture. So it's not that feminism or any questions about culture, bias, power relations, and so on are irrelevant there. So you might just cast it in terms of these broader concerns about scientific communities, I think.
Hi. So maybe pulling us a little to the future, I'm wondering, you've both spoken about some of the ways philosophy of science has benefited from feminist philosophy of science. I'm wondering if you each have an insight from feminist philosophy of science that you think it would be good for members of scientific communities or members of just the broader human community to have in their heads. And you don't need to worry about a mechanism for them getting that because there's not time to spell it out, but I'm sure you each have one.
So I think an idea that is so that I have been working with myself in relation to psychiatry and medicine is epistemic injustice. So also drawing from sort of the more general field of feminist epistemology and Miranda Fricke's ideas. But I find that this concept, once you explain it to people, even if they have nothing to do with philosophy otherwise, if you explain the idea of testimonial and hermeneutical injustice to them and why that might be a problem, it might be a problem in science, that is quite catchy and accessible. And I think it is also very important to look at with regard to like scientific communities, who gets to participate in what way, how does the credibility economy work, and so on. So I think that is an important recent addition to the literature that I would love to communicate wider.
Yeah, I guess what I usually emphasize, like in my classes, especially I teach a lot of research ethics to the sort of non-philosophers in different academic disciplines, is that I emphasize the sort of social aspects of science and say that, well, of course, it's always worth like being a nice and polite person and treating your colleagues with respectfully, but there's also an epistemic aspect to this, and because at the end of the day it also has a lot to do with like what is going to be the quality of that scientific research, and do people take into account criticism, and do they actually respond to that criticism, or are they just going to develop their fields into some kind of epistemic bubbles, so that's basically I think a message that should be of interest to sort of broader audiences.
I think then that's a signal that we've come to a good place in the end of our day. Let's thank our panel. I want to say a special thank you to Anke for staying up so late. Thank you. We really appreciate that.
Yeah, have fun with the reception. I'm going to sleep now.